Good afternoon. Welcome to the weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us, as always, to talk all things markets, University of Missouri, Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Really not a ton for us to get into this week. As we kick things off, we'll talk cattle on feed, we'll talk a little slaughter also, and a little preview ahead of the hogs and pigs report that comes out next week. Let's recap what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, on the cattle side of the equation this week, cash cattle were $4 lower for the week. On the feeder cattle side, many of those feeder cattle auctions were anywhere from steady to $7 higher this week. The August live cattle futures contract was up slightly, while the August feeder cattle futures contract was up more than $1 this week. On the choice box beef side, we were another $20 lower this week on average, which actually puts us right at year-ago levels for choice box beef. And when you look at those components, ribs and loins were certainly off hard this week, and I think had a lot to do with that additional slide in that choice box beef value. On the hog side, barrel and gilt prices were about 25 cents higher this week, while the July lean hog futures contract was down a little more than $3 this week. The pork cutout value also fell this week, down another $4. That now puts it nearly $14 below year-ago levels. And except for ribs and butts, we saw weakness on the pork components.
Scott, we talk about the decline, and we've been talking a lot about the decline on the choice box beef price since we hit that record high. As we're coming back down, it seems that we're starting to at least slow in our losses. I think we ended the day steady today. As we look at that, is that providing maybe some optimism that things might return more towards normal, especially as we look at what goes on with that choice box beef price?
Yes, so I think we are seeing that, and again, given where we were with those lofty prices a few weeks ago, we knew at some point we would come back down. I guess my concern is just the general economy and how much of a drag we get from that general economy. But it seems like we're finding some more bottom, and I guess the unfortunate part of that is we're seeing some weakness in terms of cash cattle as we continue to see a slide in the choice box beef price. I hope we can not talk about this again next week where we see another reduction, but it certainly seems to me we're finding some bottom there.
Do we get a little nervous looking at those cash cattle prices and how they've kind of slid as well in the last couple of weeks?
Yes, I am more concerned. I guess, maybe I'll become a little more pessimistic as we get through the remainder of 2020, and that the demand drag as the general economy slows is going to be more problematic than I first might have expected, that maybe we're not getting the same upward pull that we got when food service quickly closed. And I say that now as you kind of look at us reopening, it's a slow, steady progression, not the same slug like we saw when we just shut down. And so I think it's helping as we open food service, but it's not a big slug, and it may be helping offset what's overall maybe some weaker demand as the economy slows down and people have less money in their pockets. So I worry about that. And then at the same time, as you think about slaughter numbers, we talk about how well we've recovered there. Yet I have a hunch when you look at some of those plants, the way that we have increased slaughter is by maybe not capturing the same value from a carcass, whether that's cattle or hogs, as we would have in the past. That is, they've been able to do a little less of that value added on the carcass as a way to speed up the number of animals they can slaughter on a daily basis.
Speaking of slaughter numbers, today, as I look at those numbers, just the day alone, almost even on cattle, almost even on hogs, that's really a good sign for our recovery, helping us to keep the supply chain functioning. But I'm assuming we're still not getting into that backlog of animals from those shutdowns and slowdowns related to COVID-19 outbreaks.
Yeah, so I think on the cattle side, that answer is very definitely yes. And much of that has to do with just we've slowed cattle down all along the way. And so it's going to take us a while to talk about additional placements. We'll talk about cattle on feed here in a minute, but it's a little different situation. And yet I still hear some pretty high cattle weights as we're trying to work through that. If you look at cattle slaughter for the week ending June 12, 656,000 head, that's just about where we were a week ago and a year ago. On the hog side, 2.587 million head of hogs for the week ending June 12th. That's a good run, 5.5% above a week ago, and almost the same relative to a year ago. It puts hog slaughter now year to date just 0.7% below year ago levels. So we're helping ourselves, and maybe we're marginally on the hog side starting to work through some of that backlog, but that's going to take a while, even at these runs. We need big Saturday kills. We need pretty hefty daily kills as well to get through all of that backlog on the hog side.
On the opposite end of that, the supply chain is going and continuing to function. Does that also mean we're adding more and more product into a fairly saturated market at this point?
So yes, and again, I think some of the record retail prices that we talked about maybe will slow as pipelines get refilled, and I think about that relative to the grocery store side of the equation. And so maybe as prices move lower, even for consumers, we might get a little more push in terms of consumption. Food service is opening, albeit slow, and I think that's helpful as well. But it's why we're seeing things like choice box beef move lower. Those pipelines refilling, there's less demand, and rationing with prices, larger supplies, and we don't need prices as high to do that.
All right, big news for us this week. Cattle on feed report came out today. Are we really surprised as we take a look at the numbers that we saw in this month's report?
So not too much. We continue to have a wide range in terms of pre-report placements for May. That range was anywhere from 81% to 102.2, and we actually came in at 98.7, fairly close to the midpoint, a little bit above the midpoint. So placements recovering after a couple of months of very low placements relative to last year. You look at on feed June 1, 99.5% of a year ago, so very near on feed numbers a year ago. All in all, I guess I don't see a lot of surprises. I think we needed to start to see some cattle move. It seems like feed yards have had an interest in getting more cattle, as we've seen the last couple of weeks. Feeder cattle prices that have been moving higher. It's interesting when you look at the placements by state, which again, I remind you, cattle on feed are those feed yards 1,000 head and greater. Colorado and Kansas were actually above year ago levels, offsetting some of the declines in some of the other states we saw around the country.
That's really it for us this week. Kind of a short, sweet, and to the point conversation. As we look ahead to next week, really a big week of reports as well. I want to talk a little hogs and pigs. What are some things that we can expect as we look ahead to next week's report?
Boy, I wish I knew what to tell you. We were going to expect out of hogs and pigs next week. It's going to be a big report for us. And for me, it's more a sense of what can we glean out of the report in terms of backlogged hogs, the weight the market hogs by weight is going to be interesting to see. How's USDA handle euthanized hogs? Do they give us any detail there that might be helpful? I'm curious about sows farrowed and breeding inventories, and seeing whether we can, again, glean any information about how many sows might have been aborted here along the way. So critical report. I think until we can get it in our hands and try to start looking at it, we're not going to know exactly what we're going to get. But to me, this sets the stage for hogs for the remainder of 2020 in many ways, because as we've already talked, I think demand may get weaker as income losses start to hurt consumers. And now we can get a shot of what's the supply of pork look like for the remainder of 2020, our first look since really COVID. And I think that helps us get a better sense of where prices may go as we go through the remainder of this year.
And not to mention how much more important, I mean, obviously domestic demand, we want to remain strong, but that global demand picture has got to look pretty positive, or we need it to look pretty positive to finish out the year.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen the last week or two some pretty good moves there, pork side in particular. So I will say lower wholesale prices may be generating a little more export demand already. So maybe that international side and trade side will be what gives us something positive to talk about as we continue here through 2020.
All right, Scott. Also next week, reports that are coming out.
Yeah, so we'll get cold storage on Monday. Maybe we've been less focused on that, but I'm curious, what's in freezers, just given all of the disruptions that we've seen with COVID-19. And then on Thursday, we also will get livestock slaughter.
All right, sounds great. We will talk to you next Friday.
That sounds great, Megan.
Have a great weekend, Scott.
You do the same.
To have our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning, visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can submit questions and comments there as well. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to ask questions as we go along. We'll get those tossed in as well. For market updates twice daily, check out John Perkins' Market Minute. And for all the great Brownfield content and podcasts, visit brownfieldagnews.com/podcast. Have a great weekend. We will talk to you again on Monday. Or actually, we'll talk to you next Friday. What am I talking about? Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.